Hi, thank you all so much for coming. I never think I'm nervous about public speaking, and then I have to do this, and I feel nervous. Thank you to TPIC for hosting our panel, and for buying y'all lunch, and for facilitating such an amazing public interest week. This event was put together by the phenomenal boards of If When How, Lawyering for Reproductive Justice, the Custody and Support Assistance Clinic, and Penn Law Immigrants' Rights Project, which are three of my favorite groups to work with in the world. And if you are inspired by this panel or interested in getting more involved both in advocacy or pro bono, definitely reach out. My name's Anya Pere. I am a 3L. And I've worked in different ways in the space we're going to talk about today for a long time. And so over the summer, as there was a lot of attention paid to the atrocities unfolding under the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy. And that policy was in many ways awful, standalone, just in and of itself awful. Nearly 3,000 children were separated from their parents, about 65 a day while the policy was active. And in early September, 497 remained separated. Ongoing news, like the New York Times story yesterday, reminds us that many of those children remain separated, and because of issues like deep flaws in Homeland Security's computer system, the children and parents who remain separated face an uphill battle in being reunified. So in watching all this news, I was obviously really upset, as anyone was, but I also had this sense of annoyance when people asked the question, how could this happen? Or why would this happen? Or how could we do this? Or this is un-American, we don't do this. People who work, or especially people who have been impacted in and by the criminal justice, immigration, child welfare, social services, immigration systems, know that while the Trump administration seems bent on being like sort of egregious, separating immigrant families and families of color isn't a new thing. It's integral to parts of U.S. law. It's always happened. It isn't new, and it isn't surprising. So we're hoping to share some of that context and some of that knowledge with the Penn Law community today. I do want to note that while we're talking primarily about immigration today, there's a very, very important conversation, sort of separate but intersecting, to be had about the ways that the prison system and the child welfare system unnecessarily separate families, especially families of color, especially Black and Native American families. That disparity is so significant and will not be fully addressed in our conversation today, so I wanted to flag it for you guys as something that all of our groups feel strongly about and are aware of, even though we're not highlighting it today. So with that ramble, I'm honored to introduce our dynamic speakers. Abel Rodriguez is the director of Cabrini University's Center on Immigration and an assistant professor of religion, law, and social justice. Prior to joining Cabrini, he was an immigration specialist at the Defenders Association and a staff attorney at the Nationality Service Center, and he is a Penn Law alum. Jacqueline Dean came up from DC to see us today, so thank you, Jacqueline. She is a policy associate at the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. She's previously worked in progressive domestic politics and international education, and she's a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School. Elizabeth Yeager is the supervising attorney of HIAS's Pennsylvania Immigrant Youth Advocacy Project, which is the only program of its kind dedicated to providing immigration legal services to low-income children in Pennsylvania. And Professor Kara Fink directs Penn's Interdisciplinary Child Advocacy Clinic, which represents both youth in foster care and children and families seeking specialized forms of immigration relief. Before coming to Penn Law, Professor Fink helped found the family defense practice at the Bronx Defenders. And then finally, we have our amazing facilitator. Marielle is a 2L and is on the boards of both If When How and the Penn Law Immigrants' Rights Project. And without further ado, I will let her ask questions of our amazing panelists.
you guys a little bit, if you could maybe speak about who your clients are. And Anya mentioned, that there are many ways in which families are separated and many systems that lead to family separations. So if you could locate your work within those systems, just so people know kind of what the everyday work you do looks like.
Me?
Sure.
Okay, that's loud. All right, well, thank you guys again so much for having us and for everyone's interest about this topic. I think that with the family separation crisis just being so shocking and so morally outrageous, one of the good things that we've seen come out of that is just the amount of attention that people are paying to issues affecting immigrants generally, in addition to specifically this particular crisis. So, as Anya mentioned, I am an attorney at Highest, Pennsylvania, where I supervise our immigrant youth advocacy project. So our office is a legal services organization. We provide immigration legal services to low-income people in southeastern Pennsylvania. And we have within our office kind of separate projects devoted to working with certain populations. And one of those sub-projects, and the biggest one is mine, which is our youth project. It started out before me as a project staffed by one person who started as a fellow after she graduated law school. And in the time that I transitioned into that role, it kind of grew out from underneath me into what it is now, which is 8 of us doing this work. Most of the work that we do, or a lot of the work that we do, is with unaccompanied children who are mostly from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, so Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and also other countries who've come into the United States at that time on their own, not in the company of a parent or guardian, got detained and were put into deportation proceedings and are living here locally but are fighting their cases in immigration court. And so that's kind of how they know that they need a lawyer and get connected with us. Some of the children that we work with are presently in the custody of the federal government at a shelter that is here in Pennsylvania. There's a bunch of these shelters around the country. There happens to be one up in Lehigh County. And so we work with these kids who are have gotten detained by the government as they were coming into the country, and they need legal services while they're there. And the separated children who were getting funneled into that system, like this is one of those places that ended up with some of these separated kids among the general population of unaccompanied children. And we also work with just kids in the community in general, and most commonly with kids who are involved in the child welfare system. So we actually have a contract with the city of Philadelphia where they recognized a long time ago the need for expert immigration legal services for immigrant kids who do end up going into county care, like into foster care. If it turns out that the child's undocumented, they really need someone to be their lawyer to help them sort out that issue. And so we take a lot of those cases for kids in Philly and in other places. So we're usually working together with people in the child advocate world and DHS, Department of Human Services, to kind of together try to help those kids with, our role is to discreetly help with their immigration issue. But as we're doing that, we're kind of working with these kids who are at that moment experiencing separation from their families by virtue of the child welfare system. So yeah, that kind of sums up our role.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Dean. Thanks again for having me. I'm with the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, or NAPAWF. I'm based in DC because I work in the policy team, but we're a national organization. We're the only multi-issue progressive organization representing API women and girls throughout the U.S. So to that end, we have 15 chapters across the U.S. and offices with full-time organizers, really trying to build a movement for Asian American Pacific Islander women and girls, many of whom include immigrant women and children. So we work through a reproductive justice framework, and if you're familiar with If, When, How, then you would know that the reproductive justice framework is really a reproductive health and rights framework that is very inclusive and intersectional of women of color. And this means that we also work on immigrant rights and immigrant women's access to reproductive health, and we also work in economic justice, because all of these factors, especially for women of color, influence a woman's ability to access their reproductive health services and their agency on autonomy over their reproductive lives and how they raise their families. So, like I said, we work in immigrant rights, and in the past, a lot of our work has focused on family reunification visas. So, family-based visas are the main pathway through which AAPI women enter the United States. However, right now there's a huge backlog in these visa categories, and so we really advocate for eliminating these backlogs as a way of reuniting families abroad and in the U.S. And since this summer, we've also brought a lot of attention to the family separation crisis at the border, but also the ways in which family separation occurs due to our immigration laws in the U.S., whether that's through detention and deportation or visa backlog systems. And so being in DC, a lot of my work includes calling out the Department of Health and Human Services or the Department of Homeland Security, calling out these atrocities and putting pressure on specific individuals, such as Scott Lloyd, who oversees the unaccompanied minors within immigration custody, but also is the person who was known to have blocked Jane Doe, a young immigrant woman, from accessing her right to abortion. And so these are a lot of the actions that we do in DC. I work in policy, so a lot of that is really influencing legislation and the administration. Recently, it's been more of opposing and calling out as opposed to supporting and advising.
How's everyone doing? Good. Excellent. So my name is Isabel Rodriguez. In my prior role, my work was at the intersection of criminal and immigration law, and still is to some extent. So at the Defender Association of Philadelphia, as the immigration specialist, I would ensure that people who were charged with crimes in Philadelphia and were represented by the Public Defender's Office received advisals as to how those charges could affect their immigration status. Right? And then on the other side of that, at Nationality Service Center, I represented people who were formerly convicted. And so that was primarily in deportation defense, also in naturalization cases, but representing folks who a criminal conviction is impacting their ability to either remain in the country or kind of make their way through the immigration system. Now, as the director of the Center on Immigration at Cabrini and as a professor there, the three kind of primary areas of focus for our center and for the work that I do are education, so raising consciousness about these issues. As I'm sure you know, the level of misinformation on immigration issues is just staggering. So we hold events like this and get people talking about the issues. Number two is advocacy. We get our campus community, and we're expanding to other campus communities, get them involved in advocacy and activism. So keep an eye out. We're hoping in the future to be reaching out to more college and university campuses to get folks, so if you want to get folks involved, so if you want to hop on a bus, go down to DC and advocate for better policies, we may be able to help facilitate that. And research and scholarship. So we're using our research to hopefully act as a tool to create better policies and policies that are more just for our immigrant communities.
Hi, my name is Kara Fink, and I direct the Interdisciplinary Child Advocacy Clinic here at Penn Law School. And I'm thrilled to see so many folks in the room for lunch and so many folks who are interested in learning more about this. The clinic, briefly, for those of you who don't know about it, touches on areas and issues that we're going to talk about today in two ways. One is that we represent youth who are in foster care and have been separated from their families for a variety of reasons under the sort of large rubric of abuse or neglect. And we also work with unaccompanied minors, many of whom are referred from attorneys who are working with Liz at HIAS to represent them in the family court piece of their applications to be considered special immigrant juveniles under immigration law and be allowed to stay here. And so it gives us a unique perspective, I think, into the current debates about family separation and also how these cases work on the ground, which is very different often than what you'll hear in the rhetoric of either the politicians or the commentators on these issues. Prior to coming to Penn Law School, I've sort of worked my entire career since graduating from law school and being a public interest fellow, working in foster care and family court systems, and ultimately representing parents in abuse and neglect proceedings. And a lot of my work focuses on really the abhorrent lack of due process that we provide for parents in abuse and neglect proceedings, and how we characterize neglect, really what is poverty and what has a disparate impact, as Anya mentioned up front, on certain populations. And so I'm just excited that there's such interest in this topic and sort of how they both converge and diverge in our thinking and in our reform efforts. Here's just two of these if you want. Let's see if that one works.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think it's really interesting for us to see, you all highlighted the many different areas of the law that kind of converge when we're talking about this issue.
This one's on.
Is that on? Yeah. Oh, it's loud. Sorry. So yeah, the many areas of the law that converge here. And Jacqueline, thank you for talking about kind of like the broader framework of reproductive justice and also how that fits in when we talk about issues that affect families and family separation specifically. So I just wanted to kind of go back to, before everything that blew up this summer and just talk about broadly in what context you've encountered family separation and this issue prior to what recently was in the news, and just so that we can really highlight how this issue was already happening and wasn't necessarily super new, even if maybe it wasn't happening at the same level. Whoever wants to go ahead.
This is not new. It did look a bit different this summer, but the immigration system separates families fairly systematically, right? So everything from the family visa system, right, where you have different categories for different family members. So you have some family members that are able to immigrate to the United States at faster rates. They can come here faster than other family members, and so that separates families. You have hundreds of thousands of people being deported every year, which means hundreds of thousands of families being separated each year. So as I'm sure you know, under the Obama administration, it was about 3 million people who were deported from the United States. You have detention centers, family detention centers, and other detention centers, which when people are detained, even as a family unit, they are separated from their other family members, right? And are isolated for that time. And so, throughout the immigration system, in terms of detention, deportation, the family visa system, and although our immigration system is primarily family-based, of the 1.2 million people who get green cards each year, it's about 800,000 who receive green cards based on family-based petitions. There is still this family separation that occurs at many levels.
And I'll just add to that, another way that I think this phenomenon shows up in the clients that I work with specifically is sort of all of the ways in which like the socioeconomic and political phenomena that underlie migration to begin with, right? So many of the child clients that we work with, unaccompanied children, have come up to the US on their own, unaccompanied, because they were forced to by their circumstances in their home country, whether it was because they're fleeing gang violence or abuses in the home or extreme poverty and deprivation. It's caused them to have to flee and thereby separate themselves from their family down there. But at the same time, we sometimes see like pull factors of families that are trying to reunite because, one of the effects of having this kind of long-term undocumented population in the US is that, we have, for example, mom from Honduras who came up from the US 10, 15 years ago thinking that she was going to come and try to make a better life and maybe send money home and support her family and maybe return there eventually. And then things deteriorated in the home country to the point that it was, just not safe. And now teenage son is 13, 14 years old and he can't stay there on his own anymore, or the family members that he was left with are kind of at a loss and aren't willing to take care of him anymore. Maybe mom has decided that it's time for him to come up here too, that this is what the plan's going to be now, or the child's decided kind of on their own or together that they can't stay where they are. And so then we see families trying to reunite or reuniting, but they're doing that through these irregular migration patterns, and at the time that that's happening, dealing also with the potential of deportation and fighting their case and making humanitarian claims for legal relief. So a way that we see all of that come up in our work, and I know Kara does too in the clinic, that at the same time that we're working on these legal issues with these clients, just in their lives, in their personal lives, they're dealing with all of these kind of social and other challenges inherent in putting this family back together that's been separated for a long time.
Just to add on a little bit to what Abel mentioned about the family immigration system, to give you kind of a picture of what that looks like, there are different, there are country caps, so the U.S. will designate a certain number of immigrants that are allowed to enter from a certain country, and so that means that a lot of the countries in which a lot of immigrants are coming from, such as China and Mexico, they have to wait years and years and years in order for them to come. I think right now, if you're coming from the Philippines, even if you already have a family member in the US, the average wait time is about 14 years. So if you can picture waiting 14 years to be able to just live in the same place as your other family members. And then also, detention and deportation under the Obama administration was incredibly high, and spending on immigration enforcement, so this includes ICE, Immigrations and Custom Enforcement, as well as CBP, Customs and Border Protection. Those now account for more public spending than all law enforcement in the US combined. And what that does is it separates families, as you've seen at the border, but also internally. You have a lot of LPRs, or people with green cards, in addition to people with undocumented status who are fearing for their lives. And to demonstrate what this looks like for the API community specifically, immigrants from China and from India are within the top 10 countries that are approached by immigration enforcement. So I think something that's really important for our organization representing the API communities, that we often get left out of the larger immigration conversation, which I think is usually seen as a Latino issue, but actually 1 in 7 API immigrants are undocumented, and 1.3 million undocumented individuals in the U.S. come from Asian countries. And so this is something that we're always constantly trying to highlight as a form of, family separation in the U.S., and why it's so important to pay attention to a lot of the other communities that aren't necessarily being represented in the media.
So I'm not an immigration attorney, and so I'll bring the domestic perspective, and I think, right, family separation is by definition what family courts do. That's their job, that's their role. And when we think about when the state can intervene in what is considered one of the most private and intimate and protected relationships, right, for either for those of you who were children or have children, which should be all of you, that is a really intimate, private relationship. And so what could justify state intervention into that, to the extent of removing a child from their home, has always been a fascinating topic for me, and how we apply that perhaps differently based on the race or gender of the parties involved is equally interesting. And obviously I would encourage all of you who are interested in the domestic side of this to look at certainly in Professor Roberts' books that study this in depth, and we're one of the first to sort of shed light on this issue. But also a lot of the work that Professor Mayeri has done over the course of this summer, and thinking about from a historical perspective how far back this goes, right? We've done this for a really long time. This is nothing new. And so I sort of echo what I think I heard some of the other panelists say. This wasn't a surprise to us, right? The magnitude of it, and I think the response was a surprise, the sort of the public's response to it. But this has been happening in various iterations for a very long time. So domestically, there are about 437,000 kids nationally who are not with their parents and are in what is considered to be state-sponsored homes, right? Foster care. That could look like a lot of things. That could be a institutionalized residential setting like a group home. That could be a kinship foster parent who is a relative, or that could be a foster home, which is someone who is paid by the state to care for this child. That number has sort of swayed dramatically over the course of the years, and why we let kids into the system versus why we don't. And one of the things to think about, and I'll leave you with this, is that 75% of the cases, and that's a low conservative estimate, 75% of the cases are because of neglect. So even though folks may think, well, kids go into foster care because of serious physical abuse, that is not why the vast majority of children go into foster care. They enter foster care for sort of a myriad of reasons that come under this, what I would argue, ambiguous standard of neglect, which could be anything from a parent's mental health issues, substance abuse addiction, lack of basic housing, About 10% of the cases have to do with what's referred to generally as inadequate housing. And I think the question that we have to ask ourselves, both as advocates and lawyers and just members of this community, because Philadelphia has a very high population in foster care as well, is that the response that we want to have to those issues, right? Is the response to inadequate housing, parental substance abuse, and or mental illness of both the child or the parent, is the response to remove the child from their home? Or is there a different and perhaps better way that is better tiered to child well-being and outcomes that we want to do?
Thank you so much for sharing kind of like all of your experiences with working with clients, or populations that experience family separation. I think kind of like a more specific question I would like to ask is, given everything that's changed, are there any kind of family separations that could be stopped without a significant increase in resources or without a significant shift in policy? Is there... it feels like a lot of this is very discretionary and it doesn't need to be happening. So are there ways that you see that this could be addressed that wouldn't require like any kind of massive overhauls?
Well, one thing I'll just say is that so a lot of it is discretionary, right? Immigration enforcement is discretionary, and yet changing that discretion would be a significant overhaul, right? Because there was a significant change. I mean, Abel made a really good point, which is that like immigration enforcement and deportations and separation of families was certainly happening under Obama, but a thing that very drastically changed was the Trump administration doing away with the concept of prosecutorial discretion basically entirely. Right, so one thing that happened under the Obama administration back in 2014, I think, was that DHS, Department of Homeland Security, put out a very detailed memoranda saying who are the people that the government will focus their efforts to, their deportation efforts on, and there's some sense, right, you intuitively in like, okay, the government should be going after the quote unquote bad guys and not after every single person who just happens to be here undocumented, when we don't have the resources, number one, to deport everybody, even if that were a good thing for the country and people. Now we have a shift and a new memo that says, here's the priorities for deportation, and it's everybody. And in this effort to just drive up the numbers of people getting deported because of the favorable optics that comes out of that for the current administration, we have just this going after low-hanging fruit, right? So anybody who happens to encounter an immigration officer is subject to getting detained and put through the deportation process, potentially, regardless of whether that person has lived here for years without any issues, regardless of whether that person is caring for very needy children who may be U.S. citizens or may not, regardless of what the impact that could have on kids that then would get separated. So it's, where was I going with all of this? I mean, so what I'm saying is that it's not legally a huge shift in terms of no, we don't need to pass a giant law to change that, but the thinking and the action of who's a party and who's not, it is a drastic difference that, is something that we should all be agitating for a future administration to change.
Well, I struggle with the question because I think we need major overhaul.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we spend, $18 billion a year on enforcement. The level of deportations, we're looking at 300 to 400,000 people a year, is not only harmful to those immigrant communities and to those families, but to the country as a whole. In terms of detention, we have about 400,000 people who are detained throughout the year. And so we're spending billions of dollars on these policies that are both harmful to the country, harmful to the people directly involved, and harmful to families, which is what we're talking about.
Thanks. Do you want to go ahead? Thanks.
Yeah, I agree with Abel. I think we need, major overhaul. I think if we were in a different administration, different Congress, it would be an easy not easy, but you can point to specific laws and say, if we repeal these 1996 laws, then it would be fine. If you repeal these laws, then it would be fine. And a lot of that would be resolved, but unfortunately that's not realistic right now. But an example that I can give of a huge problem within our community that is a cause of one very specific law, which is one of the 1996 laws, that basically expanded the definition of an aggravated felony to include anything from public urination to selling $10 worth of marijuana. People with green cards and people who have LPR status are being targeted for deportation if they have any of these kinds of records, if they have any of these old criminal records on them. So even though they've already served their time, and even though they have since reformed their lives and they have been out of the system for 20 or so years, ICE is still targeting these populations and using those laws to be able to deport them. So this specifically impacts the Southeast Asian community. So these are mostly refugees who came to the US as children. So they were born in refugee camps and they've never been to Cambodia or Laos or Vietnam, their countries of origin. And when they came to the US, they weren't met with a lot of support from the US government in their resettlement needs. And this caused a lot of them to join gangs, and growing up in poverty, they ran into a lot of situations in which they have these what would otherwise be misdemeanors against them. And even in the Obama administration, ICE was targeting a lot of these immigrants for deportation. But in this year specifically, we've seen the largest number of Cambodian and Vietnamese green card holders being deported in the hundreds back to their countries where they've usually never stepped foot in. And so what this is a family separation crisis in itself, right? And a lot of the people who are left to care for their families are usually the women, and they're the ones who suffer a loss in income because the father or the person who's deported was the breadwinner, and they have to pay all of these legal fees in order just to even try to get their family member to come back to the U.S. or to resolve their detention or their order of deportation. And it causes a huge disruption and a lot of trauma. It causes them to relive a lot of the trauma that they suffered when coming to the U.S. And so you see kind of this double punishment. So all of this is kind of a long-winded answer to say, if we could just repeal these 1996 laws, we could avoid a lot of this trouble, but it's not very realistic at the moment, unfortunately.
Thank you so much. So I think you've all kind of touched on this, that at this point, maybe there isn't a quick fix and everything is extremely broken and really harsh for immigrants right now, especially given kind of the Trump administration's attitude towards immigrant families. So I think Professor Fink, you mentioned that you weren't really surprised by this family separation policy. So I guess my question is just, if you were surprised, what were you surprised about? And if you weren't surprised about this policy, why? Is there anything in particular from these new policies that are so different from before that you would like to highlight for the students? Or
So I think what was surprising was the tenor and context of the discussion, right? For me, that was the surprising aspect of it. Not that the government took this action, because I think, and I've been in this work for over 20 years, and so at this point, I'm not likely to think perhaps from a strengths-based perspective for the government. So it's hard for me to do that. But I think that the context and tone of the discussion of people understanding the impact of this, and where I might take this just sort of very briefly is what we have in common, right, across the work that we do, is that there are children being impacted by this, right? And the outcomes for the children, whether they're in their foster care system or in the immigration system, are really bad, right? Neither of these systems does a good job. And all of the research shows us that if you essentially grow up or spend any prolonged time in foster care, you are far more likely to be incarcerated, to be underemployed, to not graduate from high school, to be a teen parent. every metric that you're going to assess child well-being is going to be worse because you went through this system. So again, that should give us pause. And I think, if I'm correct, also in the immigration system for children who are detained in the cloth tents that we're seeing pictures of and going through this process of not knowing where their family is and being separated from their family, and the impact that that has on their attachment and their well-being and their development is profound. So if anything, I think the way the conversation shifted to take into account not simply a punitive or even a safety-based approach to the laws and the legal systems that we've constructed, but thinking about, from a child well-being approach, what are we doing as in each of these systems? And also, how can we incorporate perhaps those who are not attorneys, who may be better equipped to help us understand how to serve children, and looking at whether it's childhood development, early education work, thinking about psychology and psychiatry, how can those fields and disciplines perhaps inform this conversation in a way that then our policies and our laws can reflect them more appropriately?
Yeah, what? While I was outraged, I wasn't surprised. But I've been outraged for a very long time. That isn't new either. In terms of federal prosecutions, immigration charges have been number one for quite a while, starting primarily under the Bush administration, continued and really ramped up under the Obama administration, and continuing now. So at this point, the majority of resources in terms of federal prosecutions are being focused on immigration prosecutions, right? And the majority of those are entry and re-entry, right? So that's what the resources are being used on in terms of federal prosecution. So at this point, it's about 50% or 52% of prosecutions are immigration related. And these laws that allow what happened this summer have been the laws of this country since 1929, right? It's been since 1929 that people have been criminalized for either entering or re-entering the United States. That's not new either, right? What changed is the tenor, and there was a bit of a policy shift. And you hear these things like, oh, this is a Clinton-era law, right? There's a lot of kind of finger pointing about how this started, and no, these laws go way back. It's just how they've been treated over time and have been ramped up with every administration, whether Democrat or Republican, for the past several years, right, and past several decades. Primarily looking back to the 90s, to 96, and since then, just each administration building off of the last and expanding how these laws are used to target our immigrant communities.
So I want to play a little game, actually, called Name That Quote. So I'm going to say a quote and see if anybody can tell me who said it. So the quote is, "They'll be fine, they'll go to foster care or whatever." Mm-hmm. Does anyone, yeah?
John Kelly.
Right, John Kelly said that. Former DHS secretary, and he said that in April, I think, when asked by a reporter whether it was cruel to, as a policy, take immigrant children from their parents at the time of their apprehension, right? His response was, they'll be fine, they'll go to foster care or whatever. And I think hearing that sentiment, like, that is why we say that it's not surprising, because unfortunately, this is not that surprising to hear the people in charge who are making these decisions and making these rules be sort of that out of touch to what the actual effects and harms are for the children and families involved. And another thing that I'll just point out about the family separation crisis in particular is that, it didn't actually start in May when it all hit the news. This started in 2017. The organizations working with detained children along the border in Texas and facilities there noticed this sudden uptick in kids coming into their facilities. These are facilities for unaccompanied children, so they're typically teenagers who had traveled on their own, need to be in some form of government care and had some kind of expectation that they would go to one of these shelters. Suddenly, these kids start pouring in who were really little kids often, who'd just been ripped away from their moms who had been traveling together with them, to the point that the ACLU filed this lawsuit, one of several about the family separation issue, and kind of the main one, back in February, I think. And it just so happened that it was really timely that was in litigation at the point that later on in May, there was bigger explosion in the number of families being put through that process, and it also got a lot of public attention. And why did that somehow get a lot of public attention? I actually read an article that I saw a while ago kind of analyzing the media response to this issue, and why did it work out so successfully that suddenly all of America was outraged. And it was because, somebody had that one recording, some hero consular officer from Mexico or something happened to be in one of these meetings with a child and turned their phone on and recorded this child crying and sent that out to the press. And so suddenly, that's where the issue got all of this public attention. So I think that speaks at least somewhat to the power of just shedding light on these issues, because, horrible things can and do happen to many, many people, kind of flying under the radar when people just aren't thinking about it.
Thank you so much. So I guess my next question, just shifting kind of to the current climate, we know that, Abella, as you mentioned, there's so much misinformation in this area, and I think a lot of people don't. There's so many complicated parts of this that it's really hard to understand what's going on. We know that this report that Anya mentioned came out basically saying, that the government was totally unprepared for this zero tolerance policy, that there's a proposed rule that would allow families to be detained for longer. So there's kind of a lot of different pieces going on. I don't know if any of you feel comfortable maybe just giving us a brief summary of what the main issues are that we should be looking out for or working around right now as law students.
So I can say one thing specifically.
How long did that?
Yeah. So I'll just pick one. And so the one thing that I'll pick is this kind of false choice that has been part of the narrative this whole summer of we had to separate the families because, the courts won't let us just detain everybody indefinitely. Well, there's a reason why it has been determined by the district court in California and upheld by the Ninth Circuit that indefinite detention of children is unlawful. And so where it comes from initially is the Flores settlement agreement was arrived at back in the 90s after a whole lot of litigation, and it kind of sets out the standards of care for detained children in immigration custody. And then there was a court decision saying that settlement agreement applies to children in immigration custody whether they're unaccompanied or with their families. So when we talk about who are these families, they're mainly asylum seekers from Central America, mother or father or both traveling with their children. The government under Obama had set up and increased these family detention centers, one of which happens to be here in Pennsylvania, and these two bigger ones have sprung up in Texas and Arizona. And so I think a little over a year ago, the court held that it was that the government couldn't keep kids in those family detention facilities for more than a presumptive 20 days, which then means that the effect of that had been that the government was releasing parent and child while they pursue their asylum case. And of course, there are ways to do that both ensure that those families do show up to court, that are a lot cheaper for all of us than holding somebody in detention, and that are humane. And yet, what our current administration wants to be doing is detaining everybody for the purposes of sending a message and for whatever other reasons. But so it's not true that the choice has to be, either we separate these families or we detain everybody for a long time together. There's other options that are out there. Currently, right now, the government has proposed regulations which would eliminate the Flores settlement agreement by instead taking that agreement and turning it into a regulation, right? And so when the government proposes these regulations, there's a 60-day comment period during which the public can submit their comments and criticisms. And then they decide whether they're going to implement those regulations or not. So we're right now in the middle of that comment period. So one of the things I wanted to mention to all of you is that you yourselves or your organizations here at Penn or your other professional networks can submit comments. And the litigation folks that are in charge, that are handling the Flores ongoing case, are kind of working collaboratively with a lot of people around the country to kind of strategize about how to get comments submitted that are helpful to that litigation. But one of the points is that the more comments that get submitted for more unique people, the better. So you guys can actually do that, and I can share information later with kind of guidance on how to do it if anyone's interested.
Covered everything.
So just quickly, I'll add a couple of things. If you want to get engaged with these issues, please get engaged with these issues. The immigration law has not changed, but policy around it has changed, right? The administration has dismantled what it can in terms of policy decisions that is made around immigration law. And so DACA was ended. Right now, it's propped up by courts, right? We'll see what will happen with that. But we should be fighting for a DREAM Act, right? And doing something about DACA. TPS, about half of the countries that have been designated for temporary protected status are losing that status, right? And so if DACA ends, if TPS ends, we're talking about potentially hundreds of thousands to millions, over 1 million people that would now become deportable if there isn't a replacement for DACA and if nothing is done about TPS, right? There are about 10 designated TPS countries, and about 5 have lost that, are going to lose that status. Family detention, as Liz said, Burke's Detention Center is very close to here, and families continue to be detained there. And these false choices, if you call Governor Wolf's office and advocate to close down Burke's, he's going to say, well, we can't do that because we don't know where these people will be sent, where they will go. That obviously is not a good answer for detaining families in a detention center where there have been reported abuses, several reported abuses. And then also the refugee cap, right? You probably saw in the news that the cap has been lowered to a historic low of 30,000, which of course the cap does not mean that's the number of people who will enter. That is the maximum number of people that will potentially enter next year, and that's, like I said, a historic low. So lots to get involved with. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to open it up to audience questions and make sure that we have time for that. So if anyone has any questions right now, Greta.
Hi, I'm Greta from the 3L. I have a policy sort of question that I think at least 3 of you touched on, and I'm sure Professor Fink also has something to say about. How do you balance galvanizing sympathy where there is popular opinion for a group like separation of families or DACA recipients without labeling the rest of immigrants as less desirable, especially in the context of criminal convictions, because across the board, we see even people like Barack Obama, who I love and miss dearly, but said something terrible like, we want families, not felons. And I think that seems like a worthy cause, obviously reuniting families, but how do we do that without then alienating other communities?
I'll just, one quick response and maybe others can say more, but I mean, I think one important thing is to make sure that the voices of the people who are actually impacted are elevated to the forefront of those discussions, right? So there's been division even among, the so-called dreamers about how to frame those issues. First we had the Dreamer movement advocating for, passage of a DREAM Act to protect young people who were brought here, through no fault of their own. But on the other side of that, well, then that implies that there's somebody's fault, right? That that the parents did something wrong by trying to bring their children to the U.S. and make a better life. And so I've, personally known some people who might fit the dreamer category, but have rejected that term because of that kind of false choice that it brings up. And I've been kind of surprised sometimes and disappointed to hear even commentators that are normally really thorough and who I trust and like listening to talking about these issues and not really hitting those nuances. So I just think it's important for people to talk about and to keep the people that are most affected at the forefront.
I think that's a good segue to kind of what I was going to say, which is, centering the lives of the people most impacted and not using this whole, through no fault of their own language. And one way to, this is kind of like a shameless plug into a report that we recently published, which is kind of highlighting the stories of women who have been impacted by detention and deportation, the Southeast Asian women. And this report has a lot of policy context, but the message is not really repeal these laws and fix these things. The message that we try and drive home is look at these stories and look at the individual people who have impacted, and let's humanize those stories and put them at the forefront. So, I mean, the majority of this report is quotes by them and not research. And I think the more you bring that out there, the more you humanize people instead of just saying they're criminals. Well, they're all people, and we shouldn't be putting them into categories. So I brought some copies of these reports if you're interested. They're sitting right there.
So Greta was right. I do have something to say. It's interesting because there's already been a backlash in the domestic context, and there's been my colleague over at SB2, the former Dean Gellis, just wrote a piece that was essentially saying this is a false analogy, that you can't compare the family separation, and going into tropes and sort of a framework of good parent versus bad parent, right? So we're propping up the immigration, and we're sort of going to put down any parent who's involved in the child welfare system. And I guess my only thought would be, it goes again to nuance and history and a full understanding of the issues, because, for some, right, what was the knee-jerk response to an incredibly emotional tape, right? And hearing that and just sort of thinking of your own children or your family's children and how that could possibly happen. And that's important to capitalize, but it can't be at the expense of understanding the larger issues, because often what you have are discussions which are really smoke screens for the larger issue, right? So when we're talking about child welfare, we talk about child welfare and safety and protection, and we don't talk about poverty and racism and systemic racism. And thinking about that is really where we need to push the conversation to have an open and honest dialogue about there are some children who, for various reasons, should not remain with their parents and would not be safe with their parents, but it's not the 437,000 who are currently in care. And so how do we address that in a way that can actually handle both positions at the same time? And so that's, I think, part of how you sort of drive the narrative and perhaps keep the conversation at that level. But, as you all know, even family separation is out of the picture now, right? And that's not what people are talking about necessarily anymore. And people aren't talking about the new public charge regulations, which is another area that I will allow my colleagues who are far more versed, again, I'm not an immigration attorney, far more versed in this, but are having an impact on the clients that we work with and the communities that we're involved with, of a real sense of fear and making these really sort of abhorrent choices between whether or not they try to maintain their status or get health care for their child. So I think there's no shortage of issues, and part of it is making sure that we're not just sort of jumping on the crisis bandwagon, as my colleague Professor Pauletti calls it, right? You can't teach by responding to crisis, and you can't advocate by only responding to crisis. You need to keep some of these things in the forefront, and that's something that all of you, through your work in the law school and the groups, are really well equipped to do.
Hi, my name is Bill. I'm a board member of KSI. I'm really happy that you all came, and we're very happy to have you. I have another policy-related question. Going off of the idea that you can't only respond to crisis, one thing I've noticed in the immigration debate is that a lot of it is negative in the sense of negating something bad that is happening. That even with significantly far left, like the new Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York. I often hear there's this idea like we'll apologize, but what comes in its place is not very clear, and there's this discussion, well, you apologize, and then it just becomes a regular law enforcement agency or something. And I think that there's probably more to the immigration debate than just getting rid of things. That it's worth talking about, like what are the steps to having a just immigration system instead of just what is going wrong. And I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on, if forgetting about the current moment, if you had some level of control over what kind of immigration policy we would have, what it would look like.
So yeah, I mean, that's a hard question. Open borders for everybody. But I mean, it's a hard that if we knew that answer, then we would have had comprehensive immigration reform a long time ago. I think one of the challenges is that, like, yeah, when we talk about proposals for comprehensive immigration reform, even those things never let up on the existing really, really harsh enforcement framework. And oftentimes there's some increase in that, right? Like there has to be some concession of like, okay, well, we'll put more money to a border wall in exchange for some kind of a pathway to legalization. I mean, the reality is has never been, nor have I ever seen a proposal for like legal migration to allow people to work in the US at the level that needs to happen and does happen for like our economy to exist. We have a system of a very small system of low skilled labor temporary migration that has never aligned with what the actual like reality of the economy and workforce is, and which are horrendously exploitative. I had a colleague who does a lot of trafficking related work say the other day that pretty much anyone who has a H1B, is that what it is, or the H2A, like a farm worker visa, is eligible for a T visa because they've in fact been trafficked, because of the level of control that employers who use those visa systems can exercise over people. So I think one thing that just needs to be accounted for is just the reality of like, we have people here in the US who are participating in the workforce, in the economy, in society, and never does it seem to enter the debate to talk about like the contributions that those people are making who are not, highly skilled, for example. So that's just one thought.
Hi, I'm Alena. I'm from McAllen, Texas, where the kids were separated this summer. So it's, as a border resident native, I asked this question about interior enforcement. So I see ICE and Border Patrol as a black hole. If you have any engagement with them at a detention center, at a stop, if they're going through neighborhoods where most people are undocumented, you'll just never know truthfully what happens. There's very little public oversight on this law enforcement agency. How can we push for more oversight? And in the instance, the reality that we're operating in, that there's not, how can we make sure there's accountability when there's not institutional oversight?
I think like asking that question in the first place is sort of the first step, right? Yeah, it's hard because, as you say, ICE officers do have so much discretion and so much power and operate kind of in a black hole. And I think that's what a lot of I thought that the idea of, abolish ICE, that should be the rallying cry, like that sounds so radical. And it is too radical for people to, I think, really be putting forth as elected officials because they will get voted out. But I think if you actually unpack what that means, you learn about how ICE was created only back in 2002 with the Homeland Security Act, right? And that coincided with this sort of massive increase in power given over to those officials, in money put towards immigration enforcement. I forget what the statistic is exactly, but I think ICE is funded at a level that's just like astronomically higher than any other federal enforcement agency. And I think it begs the question again, which I think you asked, of like, why is it that we look at immigration as this above any other, federal legal infraction is a thing that we must be putting all of these money and resources towards. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, or did I have a better answer to your question?
Senator Kamala Harris and Representative Pramila Jayapal have both co-sponsored and introduced an act in Congress called the Detention Oversight, Not Expansion, to spell out DONE Act. DC is never short of acronyms. And I think, I can't remember specifically all the provisions of the bill in my head, but it's kind of a starting point as to, how can we start investigating into these detention centers and, going through all these review boards to really figure out what is happening and have annual reports to figure out what is happening in these facilities as a starting point, and then into reducing the number of beds that are in these facilities. So I think that's something that's worth looking into. I think right now there's a lot of talk about, these things will never get passed, but I think to your point earlier, I think it's just as important to lay the proactive groundwork in policy so that when we do have a favorable administration in Congress, that these things will be able to get more attention and possibly passed. So that's maybe a bill that you could look to for ideas or things that are kind of moving on the ground already from more progressive representatives in Congress.
I know we've been talking a lot about what can happen at the federal level, and I was wondering, and we touched a little bit on Berks, but I was wondering if you could speak to policy changes that we could be pushing for at the local level under the Kenny administration. I know over the summer he ended his agreement with PARS, but what do you see as next steps in terms of making sure our city lives up to its promise of being a sanctuary city in practice?
I was reading a book about sanctuary, so I'm
I knew I should mention that. Read the last chapter of our book, written by Erika y Miron at Juntos. Caitlin Barry and Erika are writing a chapter on this. We're writing a book about sanctuary in Philadelphia. And so I don't want to speak for Erika, but I think she's kind of the visionary in Philadelphia for where it needs to go. And Juntos are kind of the visionaries for where Philadelphia needs to go. And some of the things that they've already mentioned is stop racial profiling. Sanctuary goes beyond cooperating with ICE, right? Law enforcement cooperating with ICE. And so, they're saying, well, we need to end racial profiling in this city, right? We need to end racial disparities in terms of arrests, convictions in this city. We need ICE out of our courtrooms. Right. So even though Philadelphia is a sanctuary city, ICE is still arresting, apprehending people at the CJC, at the Criminal Justice Center. Right. So let's get ICE out of our courtrooms. And Philadelphia right now is one of the hardest hit cities in terms of ICE enforcement and in terms of deportations. If you look at the numbers, I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's because Mayor Kenny has been so vocal. So I hope he continues to be that way. But you can see them trying to retaliate. We got to keep pushing forward. And there are still some policies to be a true sanctuary city as we keep working towards that.
So I apologize for that, because I think that it's been our definition of sanctuary, but I appreciate your
Mm-hmm.
So my question was going off of what abolish ICE was mentioned a couple times. Do you guys think that it's possible to curb some of the atrocities and abuses and the overall expanding criminalization of immigrants that you guys have been discussing without fundamentally attacking the machinery that allows that? So ICE, like the enforcement and deportation machinery, if not abolish, at least structural changes in how we fund that and how much authority they have and whether or not the agency looks similar or not similar to what we have today.
I don't really know how to answer that question. I mean, this is maybe not responsive, but I kind of want to mention, just because it's related and I haven't heard talked about yet, is the immigration court system, right? So, and a thing that we're seeing right now that's really troubling is, in addition to ICE kind of exercising its power to the fullest extent, is attacks on and a deliberate curtailing of the independence of the immigration court system and the immigration judges who operate under the Department of Justice. So Jeff Sessions is the boss of the immigration judges, which kind of is a little bit weird to think about when this is supposed to be a neutral decision maker. So one thing that I think could have a real impact and that should happen is that the immigration judges should be given independence, which they don't have now. You know, that could be something that like structurally could change, and this is something that the judges themselves through their union have long advocated for, is to be able to have independence from the Department of Justice. Instead, what we're seeing is all of these kind of decisions getting handed down by the Attorney General that are both trying to take away those judges' independence and kind of force on them what to do, and at the same time increase immigration enforcement to be like sending more and more cases through that system and taking away the ability of the courts to actually properly adjudicate each case. So I think one thing that actually everybody theoretically should be able to agree on, regardless of what side you're on, is giving more resources and better resources to the courts and letting those judges be independent to do their jobs.
Yeah, I think maybe we have time for one more question.
So as a continuation of following and speaking about the immigration court system, can any of you speak to the intersection of dealing with the immigrants' rights issues once they've already happened versus strengthening the immigration court system so that there are more judges, so there's less of a backlog, and that immigrants are getting processed and not having to wait so long? Is there any looking beyond 2020, what's kind of in the pipeline for getting that rolling, so that the backlog issue and a lot of the consequential issues from that don't necessarily need to arise?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so it is happening right now. In fact, I think I just saw an announcement the other day of like 47 new immigration judge hires or something around the country or something like that, which is like a good step, right? Except that it also so happens that the people getting selected to be in those positions and funneled into those positions are often people with an enforcement background. So just, another issue that comes up when we think about that is like not just expanding the system, but paying attention to the fairness of that system in terms of who's being put into it and how are they being like directed to do their jobs, and what are the decisions that are coming down, legally about the laws that those people are implementing.
Yeah,
Okay. Oh, go ahead, yeah.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, yeah, I get your question, but I think the response to this record number of deportations shouldn't necessarily be, well, how do we accommodate that? It's reduce the number of deportations, right? Make it so that there isn't a need for that number of judges, or for an increased number of judges, right, in that deportation system.
On the side of like processing claims before, so like the people who are coming in and claiming asylum and refugee and all that stuff, rather than on the outside of like they've already been deported and now like they're getting their case.
Yeah, another thing I'll mention on that front, I mean, so you said specifically immigration courts, but a lot of immigration cases get decided by the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is like an administrative body. So if somebody's filing an affirmative application for a visa or for citizenship or a lot of immigration benefits, it doesn't go to the immigration judges, it goes to this other agency. Yeah, no, but that's okay. But it, that makes me think about and want to highlight one thing, which is that so it's kind of impossible to succinctly talk about all of the ways in which the government is currently making life harder for immigrants. But one of those has to do specifically with USCIS and how they process cases, to the point that earlier this year or last year, this agency, it is not the enforcement agency. The way that the structure is set up by the Homeland Security Act is that you have ICE, that's the enforcer. You do have the immigration courts that decide these cases in court. You have USCIS that is the benefits granting agency. They adjudicate these claims and they make decisions. They're not the ones deporting people. And there is a distinction between those two things. But last year, that organization, that agency USCIS, they revised their mission statement. And it's changed significantly to where it used to, it no longer talks about deciding applications for benefits. It talks about protecting the United States from immigrants, which is not like at all kind of what that framework should be. And it's really frustrating and disheartening that sort of all the way up to that level of like the public kind of how that organization is, how their mission is framed for the public and for the people that work there has just shifted so drastically. And it makes me a little bit sad thinking about all the work that lies ahead to kind of fix these issues when we're hopefully someday in a position with different people in charge who might be inclined to fix them.
One last question. Some people have class at 1:15, some at 1:30. So one question.
So one of the common responses you hear is that why don't they just enter their country like legally? So could you speak to the merits of any of the argument of the response that that legal and efficient means of immigration aren't necessarily available or allowed to are granted to families of Black and brown families?
Well, yes, good question. Feel free to add on to this. But there are limited ways that people can enter the country, remain in the country, or get a green card. I don't want to oversimplify, but this could take some time to unpack, so I'm going to simplify a little bit. One of those are family visas. There are quotas for most of the categories, so that's the backlog that we talked about. Some that are out like 23 years, right, where people have to wait to be able to enter the United States. The other is